live. We're having a great time today. I hope are able to join some of our other sessions in addition to this great session. So thanks everyone so much for joining us, for your support, for your interest, and for your time. Today, right now in this session, we're going to be talking about what racial and gender equity means to us and why, in the middle of a pandemic, we decided to launch a center with that name, the Center for Racial and Gender Equity. So during this session, we welcome your feedback and your questions. And I'm so happy for the group we have to talk about this. So I'm joined by three of my favorite folks. Today we have Deb Gadsden. Deborah Wilson Gadsden is a 47-year veteran of the child welfare arena. So as a training specialist with Family Design Resources, she's recently been focusing her efforts on racial and social justice issues, and she's a member of our YWCA Social Justice Training Team. She's also a member of our board of directors and the chair of our mission committee, which is a special committee of the board that really does a deep dive onto issues surrounding our mission to make sure the board is focused all the time on what makes this agency unique and our real purpose. Thank you, Deb, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So I'm also joined today, we have Jasmine King. Jasmine is a native of Lancaster and a graduate of Millersville. She's led efforts to combat poverty and homelessness in Lancaster County and to uplift the voices of children and youth seeking forever families or reunification. And in each area of this work, she has witnessed the significant impact of racial and gender inequities. In her words, our new center motto is to listen, learn, and lead. And she says she's thrilled to step into the role of director for our Center for Racial and Gender Equity. We'll establish a trusted center that will challenge structural, racial, and gender barriers to equity in the county. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you.
And I want to introduce Adam Hosey, who's joining us today. Adam is also a training coordinator with our center at YWCA, but when he's not doing that, he's an abolitionist educator who teaches English, Black history, and feminist history at SciTech campus of Harrisburg High School. Adam is also a Philly nationalist and a sandwich connoisseur who has named his cats Reuben and Monte Cristo. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So I'm Stacy Blake. I'm the CEO here at YWCA Lancaster. It's my 1-year anniversary in this role, and what an exciting year. You know, in my research and foundational learning about this new role and our agency, I found out that our building right there at the corner of Lime and Orange Street in Lancaster City was actually opened during the last pandemic. So this is our second pandemic at YWCA. And when I think about that first go round, the building had opened after 30 years of local organizing and work by women to create this space to support each other and to support other women in the community. And then they opened this beautiful building after all of that work and effort and saving, and it has to close. So that sadness and frustration is exactly what I was feeling when we had to close this year. Back in March, you'll remember. And I was so concerned, of course, about our very vulnerable residents who live in the building and our families who needed childcare and our staff. And just while all of that's on my mind, of course, we all are made aware of the killing of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others are really brought to the forefront of our consciousness. Streets were filled across the nation and in downtown Lancaster and other cities in the county. And as a new leader here, I was kind of waiting and watching to figure out who really would lead and lean into leadership in this space to really talk and drive a conversation about racial equity. Because I wasn't sure. There are longstanding organizations here, and I certainly didn't want to, step on anyone's toes. And one day, as I was walking back to the office, and I turned the corner, and there is our beautiful building, still on the corner of Lime and Orange Street. But our building says right on the side, our mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. And I knew right then, this is the work that we need to lead. So that was the birth, the origin story of our Center for Racial and Gender Equity. I talked with the board, I talked with our social justice trainers, I talked to other YWCA leaders around the country. So here we are. We launched the center, and I'm so happy to get to talk about this more. So I want to start by asking my colleagues, this name of it, Center for Racial and Gender Equity. What does that really mean to you? And I'm going to ask you, Ms. Deb, if you could go first.
So what it means to me, and when we talked about it as part of the board, and then the little subcommittee that really dug deeper into what we wanted to have happen, it meant to me that there would be hopefully less disenfranchised individuals who would exist, that this center would help to bring focus and positive energy and change to a group of people who are always on the outside, it seems, looking in. And so when you think about mainstream culture, you think about the white supremacy environment that we all live in, these are the people who are always on the outside, and that we would have an opportunity then to put some time and energy and focus onto their issues so that eventually the world would open up and we would come to a time when maybe we don't have to focus so much on it.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Jasmine, how about you? What does the literal name of the center mean to you?
Yeah, so the name really hits home with me. The word equity, first and foremost, just recognizing the differences in the ability and the concept of fairness and how we can achieve that the same outcomes, but meeting people where they're at. So I can appreciate racial and gender equity because it's acknowledging that there are disparities in those two areas. It's also acknowledging that the system is out of balance that is created right now. And if we can bring it up to balance, we all will benefit from it. It's not a system where we're trying to put anybody ahead of anybody, but recognizing that there are current inequities that lie within the process with racial injustice. So I love the title. I love bringing it back to that every time I talk, especially because a lot of times we've been hearing the word diversity, and I love to stress that factor of racial inequities first and foremost before you can move forward.
I want to come back to that idea, so I'm going to ask you to talk about that more in just a minute. But Adam, tell me, so what does this title mean to you?
For me, it means intersectionality and knowing that we cannot talk about one form of oppression without acknowledging the other. So, even in the news, when you think about the Black bodies that have been killed at the hands of police, we hear names like George Floyd and Eric Gardner, and all those names are also tragic, but we don't hear names like Natasha McKenna. It took a lot of work to make sure Breonna Taylor's name was still in the news. Sandra Bland just seemed like a one or two news cycles and has been largely forgotten by that white supremacist system that we work in. So for me personally, especially being a man who is not Black, it's understanding my own reflection and how I was socialized and understanding all the ways that oppression works and making sure that we're addressing all of them as best we can.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that, Adam. So, Jasmine, I want to come back to you for a second. So you kind of touched on the difference between this idea of equity that we are promoting, and then also, of course, we hear a lot about diversity, and sometimes we hear diversity, equity, and inclusion as sort of this triad. So can you just say a little bit about how you see the difference between diversity and equity? Oh, and put your sound on.
Yep, sure. So I like to think, and I want to say that this is true, that if we achieve racial equity, diversity and inclusion will fall into place. So if we give back to the people, including people of color specifically, making them owners, planners, makers at the table, then you're going to have a diversified look within your organization specifically. If we acknowledge and account for the current inequities and provide for all people, everybody's going to benefit from that equitable solution. So I think the focus should always be examining the racial inequities, and then diversity and inclusion will fall into place instead of putting those things kind of out of balance.
Yep, yep. Thanks for that. And Adam, I'm coming back to you too for a definition on a word you used. You said intersectionality, and you talked about the intersection between race and gender. Can you just speak on that a little bit more? Because I want to make sure that we're all using words the same way.
Yeah, so intersectionality was a term that was coined by a lawyer named Kimberly Crenshaw, who is still active. She's still practicing law and has a number of great things out there, podcasts, books, etc. But when she was practicing law, she made sure that she had to argue that if women are facing sexual harassment in the workplace, Black women who face sexual harassment are also facing racial harassment as well. So that the ways that the cumulative effects of oppression will work together to make an even larger form of oppression. It gets confused sometimes, and people think intersectionality just means diversity. But according to Crenshaw, it's like very much a theory of oppression and understanding how systemic forms of oppression works, not something to like celebrate, oh, look how unique we are.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Adam. And absolutely a nod to Ms. Crenshaw for this paradigm shift for many people in how we think about this work. So I wanna come back to you, Deb. Some people say that we've had a civil rights movement. We've had a Black president. And yet we have people literally marching in the street calling for justice and equity. So what would it look like? So apparently it would not necessarily look like having a Black president. So what would it take? What would it look like if we had racial and gender equity?
So I think it would look like the ways that I think that we have to do things now would probably disappear. So we wouldn't have to make sure that the educational system was equitable for Brown and Black children, or that they had the same number of books or the same numbers of opportunities that our white students have. So I think that because I've had the opportunity to live through this whole racial reckoning twice now, in the 60s and now again, that we would move forward and not have a period of intense activity and then everything just dies away and we go back to what it was. I was just on another call with a group that I sit in on, a diversity task force through the Child Welfare Resource Center, and we were talking about a situation, and it reminded me of systems theory. whereby every system, whatever changes you put into it, is always going to fight back to get back to where it was. And so what it would look like for me is that there would definitely be a paradigm shift, and that shift would occur not only in the system, but in each one of us that makes up the system. So while we're asking for the dismantling of racial and gender inequity, we would also be looking for individuals to embrace their own individual biases, confront them, change them, and look at people in a different way, look at everybody in a different way. And if everybody did that, then the system that we represent would be a more equitable system.
Right, right. Thanks for that answer, and really, highlighting there's multiple ways that we need to be working on this. We need to do our internal individual work and our work one-on-one to those around us, our peers, our circles of influence, but also systems need to shift. That's what I hear you saying. Yep.
Yes.
So Jasmine, what would it look like if there was equity?
Yeah. So I like to think of it that no one race is the key determining factor for another race socioeconomic status or their access to healthcare, education. It's also that inclusion of the creation of including the oppressed. So our Black and Brown community being part and change makers in the institutional policies and practices that are going to impact their lives. To me, that's what it looks like. I think the population, the world population for women is 49.55. I'm going to throw that out there. It's somewhere around there. And then you think about all of the policies that exist that are holding back and creating those gender inequities currently. So it looks like that fairness factor and women being able to have a deciding voice in what things that are going to directly affect them. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
So Adam, I want to turn to you with this same question, but I want to ask it from a little different perspective. So if we achieve this, am I going to lose something? Am I going to miss out somehow?
No, equity actually would really benefit everyone. So for me, what equity means is that we are all able to be ourselves. So if we think about patriarchy and toxic masculinity, patriarchal systems have taught men that they need to hold in their feelings, they need to dress a certain way, they need to do all these things to be gendered as a man. But if we broke down these walls and broke down these systems, men would be able to express emotions and be okay and not be chided for shedding a tear or anything like that. And then the same thing goes when we think about sexuality and heterosexism. We have so many of these rigid rules that society creates for us that we're socialized by that we have to follow in order to survive sometimes. Our marginalized groups have to survive. So for equity, it means like truly being able to be ourselves. Of course, I also often joke with friends that, we should just shoot all men to Mars for a couple years and see what happens. I think it would be an okay experiment. I'd be happy to go to Mars and just fix the planet for a little bit.
So thanks for that, Adam. And, Jasmine, you said something when you said the global population of women, whatever the number is, 49.5. It seems like if there was equity, then across the world, then, or in our community, then the positions of power would be, half of them generally would be held by women, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And I mean, but it's clear that organizations are forcing, specifically when we talk about women, to conform to the organization rather than working in an equitable standpoint to change the organization to be for everybody and fit all. So when you do that, that's where we create this system where women are held back, giving voice behind the scenes, putting in the work behind the scenes, and not getting any credit, gratitude, pay, or leverage to advance in different areas. So that's exactly what I'm saying, is that if we had gender equity, it would be achieved and you would see more women rising to the top.
That's really something to think about. And it's hard because obviously the four of us have grown up in the system in the United States as we have. And so I'm trying to think of the space that I've been in where half of the leadership is women, or where the leadership or the active participants are the same makeup as the community.
So Stacy, I can say that I've been in a field of work where the majority of the participants, the professionals, are women. And sometimes the representation of men is in leadership positions, but a lot of times the representation of leadership is female. And that in and of itself is not going to give us gender equity, because many times as we become female-led organizations, as women, we take on what we've been taught in terms of the masculine dominance within our society. And so even though we're presenting that with a female face, we're using male-dominated, male-oppressive tactics to manage our organizations and to manage our staff. So just putting women in those positions of power is not going to automatically guarantee us that we have a systemic change. Again, I think it goes back to how we internalize information and what changes we make within ourselves. So if we come at it from a female voice, then we'll see that change. But if we just channel that male-dominated mindset, we're going to be in the same position. We'll just have a different look.
Oh, thanks for breaking it down again. So it's back to doing the internal work, changing our thought patterns, and changing the system again. Yep. So if we were going to do that, that sounds like a lot to do. What in the world is the most impactful thing? Because there is a lot to do, and always we feel under pressure, and there's a lot going on in our world right now. We just had an election. We still have a pandemic. There's a lot of people out of work. There's an economic crisis, and now I'm also hearing maybe concerns about basic goods again. So how do we know what the best next thing to do is? Jasmine, what's your thinking on that? Like, what's the next thing to do?
Well, I would always want to bring it back home and say to tap into everything, the resources that we have here at the Center for Racial and Gender Equity with YWCA Lancaster. I think that foundational work with the Racial Equity Institute is key, so that you know how to go back into the world and dismantle and challenge systems and speak on behalf of the marginalized and oppressed. So that I would want to bring it back home to say our Racial Equity Institute is a good program to start at for that learning. I also want to stress the importance of doing that personal growth of listening, podcasts, listening to others' voices, not always asking for their story to be told, but openly hearing. And I love how we talked about hearing and trusting the story that's being told, not creating an alternate narrative or running into just believing one narrative that's being told in media specifically. So that's another thing. Reading books. There is there's a number of books that are out there that are awesome. And I can't stress enough a number of books that have been created by BIPOC folks that really render the voice of the oppressed and give a lens that'll leave room for growth. Challenging systems. We just hit an election. Elections are not a one-time thing. And I think that's surprising to some people because we focus so much on the presidential elections, but there's so many in between times for voting. So I think continuing to know where you stand in your community and locally, and what your position is, and weighing in on what you think that your community deserves. So when election time comes, being part of that, getting out there and helping folks get to vote, and voting, knowing who you're voting for is important. Staying in tune with the news. I could go on and on. Staying in tune with current news is also important so that you understand your role, the shifts that are happening, and the impact that you can make. There's plenty of petitions out there that are calling for change and for action right now. And I look at it, and you look at the world population, even our population here in the United States, and more of those petitions or acts should be signed, and more that'll hold more people accountable for things that are holding us back. So those are some of the steps that I think need to be taken immediately. Knowing what you're passionate about and finding that area and digging deep into it.
Jasmine, before I go on, I want to come back again to definitions. You used the word BIPOC. Can you tell us what that means?
Yes, so that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So that's recognizing our Black and Brown community, as well as our Native American Indigenous community.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Adam, I want to ask you what you think the next step would be, but I also want to pose this question. So two things. Jasmine had a lot of recommendations just now about books, podcasts, news media, ways that we can learn more and change our internal systems and ways of thinking. But some people say, well, I really feel like I could learn this better if someone would just tell me one-on-one their story. And then I would know that it was true and I could just hear it from them. Like, what's your response when people, really want to just hear it from a person who's Black, a person of color, an Indigenous person?
Yeah, I think this kind of speaks to the debate of like, do we need to watch the death of George Floyd, of Ricardo Munoz, or should we be able to just understand that these horrible things happen and it's because of systemic causes? So there are certainly BIPOC folks who really do love telling their story, and that is great. But we also just have to have an understanding of humans' individuality, and that some people don't want to tell their story. So for me, a lot of it comes down to building relationships. So you need to have strong relationships with people in order to build that relationship and perhaps hear that story. And thinking about the listening that Jasmine was talking about, one thing that the University of Michigan's Intergroup Dialogue Group does is they say that you need to listen to learn, not to respond. So I feel like in this society, we're all about debate. I must be right. I must be right. But we need to try to listen in order to learn rather than to have an immediate response.
Yep. Boy, that's a powerful statement. Listen to learn, not to respond, not to debate. So on that note then, Adam, what's your most impactful next step that you think that people can take towards equity?
I always think about the writer Hanifa Dur-Rakib. He's a Black Muslim author and poet. He has a very powerful essay in where he writes, I don't want my people to have to die in order to be loved. So like from that high level space, that's that. From a very practical space, two things that are like very close to right now. Today is the extra give. If you look at the boards of the majority of these nonprofits, They're going to be predominantly white, and they're going to be predominantly white men, and they're also going to be predominantly people that have wealth. So how are we diversifying our boards in Lancaster? And then also next week is Thanksgiving, and this year's Thanksgiving is going to look very different. Hopefully it looks a little different, thinking about physical distancing and all of that. I think this is a really important time where we have time to reflect on Thanksgiving and the way that we've been taught what Thanksgiving is. The first term Thanksgiving was used after colonists would raid an indigenous village, murder and steal, and then they would have a big meal after it. And they used to call that Thanksgiving. But of course, what we were taught is that it was this very nice meal between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans of unity. And that did happen, like that was an event that occurred. But we also have to hold both those truths. So often we only hold one truth. We have to have space for the whole story.
Thanks for that. You know, you remind me when you say, you know, space for the whole story. One thing that we've been talking about in our Racial Equity Institute, there's a session happening this week. And of course, we did a review of history and sort of adding in some of the factual history of both our county and our country. And when we do that, so many people who are in the room say, well, I was never taught about that. I didn't know that before. So I think that's just another example of the individual learning that we can do so that we really have a fuller understanding. And when I come to understand more about the Thanksgiving traditional holiday, for example, it's pretty horrifying. And I can't imagine, unless I read narratives, how a Native person feels as other people in their country celebrate and glorify a very painful history. Okay, Deb, you know, we're heading over to you. You know, what do you see as an impactful next step that you could imagine for our county?
So I would like to first add on to something that Jasmine said, and that is that we continue to offer the Racial Equity Institute to individuals, because I believe that because of the various levels of racism, you know, and the fact that we start from our individual racism to interpersonal racism to institutional racism to systemic racism, that we have to start with individuals and help them to make the adjustments that need to be made. And then move forward, because if we can get an individual to get their head straight about what's going on, then when they interact with another individual, hopefully they'll either teach that person something or learn something from that person. And they'll keep the dialogue going. And then we individuals become groups. And, you know, if we've got that moving through all of those levels, we can dismantle racism along all of those levels. The other thing that I think needs to happen that would be very impactful is the notion of power releases. You know, so much gets caught up in who's in power, who has the authority, who makes the decisions. And we get so caught up in power grabs and trying to keep that power all to ourselves. I think those are some of the things that are at the basic levels of why we have so much racism going on in the world. And the other piece to that is acceptance of the fact that our world is browning. The United States is browning, but we don't want it to be burning. We want people to be able to understand that that's a natural evolution. And just because the numbers may change and the percentages shift, you know, doesn't mean that things are going to be taken away from you, especially if you're coming from a place where you're willing to share what's there.
Deb, I don't know if you were up late planning to drop some of these some of these pearls you just did, but
Yes.
we're going back to these. So just for the record, I'm really struck by what you said about power releases.
Mhm.
That's really something to consider at so many levels, I mean, I can reflect in this moment on how I can release power within the role that I have, my professional role and my personal roles, absolutely. And browning, not burning. Deb, I'm going to need you to go back to that for just a minute. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So I didn't coin that phrase. I sat in on a webinar last week and actually was helping to deliver the training. And we had a speaker from the Center on Race and Social Problems out of the University of Pittsburgh. And his name is Dr. Jay Hughley. And he's one of the directors at that center and one of the professors at the University of Pittsburgh. And he gave us a very historical perspective of racism in America. And he started with helping the audience to understand that the origin of people of color is not slavery. We come from a land where we were kings and queens. We had empires. We had inventions. We had a whole life that was comparable to what we have created in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so for us to think that slavery is the start of the African American experience is erroneous.
Mm-hmm.
And then he moved forward in his timeline to start talking about the many atrocities that have been done to people of color. Mm-hmm. And I don't have them all in my head, but we all know what those atrocities have been over the course of many years. From the Reconstruction era to Jim Crow to, having to do the civil rights law to have the opportunity to vote. Mm-hmm. We had a presentation last week about veterans, and my organization showed a video that had not one single person of color in that whole video about veterans, when we know that millions and millions of people of color served and died for our country, mm-hmm. even when they didn't have the right to vote. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Hughley just gave us this really nice progression, and he said to us, while America is browning, we really don't want it to be burning. Mm-hmm. We don't want people to just scorch the earth because they're not getting their way or because power is shifting. Mm-hmm. And people's attention is being taken other places. There are things that we should be doing together so that we can embrace the changes that are happening in our world.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. I really think that's powerful thinking right there. I'm looking at my great team here, and I'm wondering, what haven't we talked about? What do you want to ask each other?
I guess I honestly want to pick your brain a little bit, Stacey. The legacy of racism is it's brutal, it's horrific, and it's deeply personal. And you asked us all what we see in the future. And I just want to ask that same question back to you. What do you see for the future?
Thanks, Jasmine. Well, what I want to see is more courage by white Americans to face some painful historical information that we weren't taught, and to understand the impact that it continues to have within our communities. Not just the information, but the resulting policies and practices. You know, Deb just touched on the topic of veterans who served in all of our armed forces, and you know the reality that the returning veterans who were Black and brown were not able to access the GI Bill. You know, that's just something that we don't talk about, because we like to talk very proudly about our veterans, of course, and of supporting them with the GI Bill and the Veterans Administration and so forth. But if it wasn't accessible in the states because of local harsh laws and policies, we have to be honest about that. And then the legacy, if you couldn't get a loan through the GI Bill to buy a house, then your family has not been able to build that generational wealth. And you know, I understand and embrace and have sat in painful conversations and very uncomfortable situations as a woman who's white, to really hear what I hadn't been taught before. But now that I know it, I do need to have courage. And you know, the other thing that I believe is true is that when I really understand the privilege that I have, and by that I mean that I'm white, that I've had advanced education, that I have a good paying job, that I have access to people in power to have conversations and to get information and to learn more, that I'm able-bodied, that I'm cisgendered, all of these things, that gives me much more freedom to walk through the world. And I need to use that to make space for everyone who does not have all those privileges that I have. And I need to really accept that I'm not in danger when I stand up for someone else, or when I bring someone else along or make space for someone else. I really am not in danger to speak the truth. And I want more courage for women like me and men who have some shared identities that I have about being white and educated and privileged in so many ways. Let's just have a little more courage right now.
Thank you.
Adam, do you have a question? Or Deb, do you have a question for?
I don't know that I have a question, but I have another comment that I would like to make. I don't know that I'm looking for there to be all these kumbaya moments, you know, that go on in the world now. But what I am looking for is for people to have some cultural humility, for me to accept who you are and where you are, and not try to impose any thoughts or ideas that I may have about you on you. I know in my field, we had a reckoning about whether or not we were including youth and young people in the decisions that we were making about them. And Jasmine, you remember this from the time you worked in our field, you know, and our young people rose up and said to us, nothing about us without us. And I think that that same thing applies here. Nothing about people of color, Indigenous and Black people of color, without us being part of the decision-making process. You know, don't assume that you know what is best for me. Ask me, and I will tell you what is best for me. And then move on what I tell you. Don't try to discount it. Don't try to change it to make yourself feel better about it. Just accept it in the way that I offer it.
Thanks, Deb. Cultural humility, another big idea that we need to embrace.
Deb, you need to have like a Poor Richard's almanac of these gems that you are dropping.
Because you said something in there as well about prioritizing humanity. And that sticks out to me too. I agree, Adam.
We're going. That'll be our first publication of this.
Right. Well, I did just recently be published within the Child Welfare League's Child Welfare Journal. So I'm on that slant right now. I'm on that app. We can go there.
Hey, Toni Morrison's first book was in her 40s, right? So this is your career. I had a question for all of us, is that this work is incredibly overwhelming. Thinking about all these things that we have to tackle. How do we kind of ground ourselves and kind of take that burden off our shoulders a little bit and really like take care of our minds and hearts and bodies? So I can start, and it goes back to the idea of anti-racism and the definition of anti-racism and how we have to identify it in ourselves and work towards eliminating it. So for me, it's kind of a relief to know that like I am not perfect. I do sexist things. And as a person of color, I still conflate and work within systems of white supremacy. And that's kind of a relief to me. And that might sound weird, but knowing that I can make mistakes and focusing on how I'm alleviating and trying to fix those mistakes is helpful for me.
So I can go next, Adam. I think that I have to recognize that I'm a work in progress, that I'm going to get tired doing the work. I have to surround myself with other people of like mind so that I don't get exhausted by those other individuals who have a different mindset. And also I have to realize that I will not do someone else's work for them, and that goes, on my job, in whatever arena I'm in, I cannot do someone else's work for them. I can be receptive to you coming to me and asking me to help you understand something or to point you toward a resource that will help you, but I can't do your work for you.
So I wrote down a few things, just hearing Adam and Deb, both of your responses. So mine is just still going through some healing things. I didn't know until you enter into certain areas of work, you don't know sometimes what your triggers are. So even entering into this work, I've realized that I had certain triggers that I need to go back to and really heal through that. And understand it better. So that's one thing to do. Another thing was just being in alignment. And that doesn't mean that I don't deal with certain people that don't have the same ideas that I have or understanding, but aligning myself in that I can I can give the information, I can say something, and then from there, I've given the tools, and then I have to keep going on the path that I'm going on. I'm not veering off the path to try to bring everybody on board and just making sure that everybody's equipped, but staying in alignment with where I need to be. Also, I, over the last couple of months, centered myself with a tribe. I want to call it a tribe. So just people that I can call on that'll take my head away from the space sometimes of this work so that when I come back, I'm refreshed and rejuvenated. So I have different people in my lives that I access for different things and check in. And then it helps me to check in with myself a little bit better to stay centered. So those are some of the ways that I'm able to continue to do this work.
Yeah. And I'll add, I do have other white folks that I can talk to and confide in, especially those times, Adam, where you mentioned like you're wondering, was that a mistake? Or how could I have said that better? How do I clean this up or fix this? Or just wondering about a situation. So having other folks that I trust where we can, learn together and talk about those situations. I would say I am not so good at the stepping away from it, I literally talk about race every single day in my work and in my personal life. And it might be just a small thing, just like noticing, oh, that's interesting how I thought this way, but someone else thinks a different way. Or it might be a big thing, like really, talking about something that is in the news, or a painful situation, and really digging deep about that. So, but I also find joy in unexpected things, and I'll just share one, since I think Jasmine and I both heard about it this week, of a child who attended a program with us last year for our Martin Luther King Jr. birthday celebration. And this was a special time for children at the building, where we had local Black leaders read books to the children. Everyone got to take home a book about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so that was a year ago. And so one of those children was talking to a teacher this week, trying to reference that event, but she didn't know the words, and she didn't really know what building she had been at. And so she was describing it, and she said there were older people and there were kids and there were all kinds of people and books, and it was nice, and everyone got to take a book home. And she was describing being at YWCA for this event. And it just brought me so much joy that her experience of being in our space for that event was exactly kind of what we've been talking about today. What would it look like and feel like if there were equity? So I certainly want to give each of you an opportunity for, a last remark, more words of wisdom from Miss Deb. We're getting close on our time, but I do want to give you a chance for any wrap-up remarks.
I would just say that everyone owes it to themselves to be open to learning. We have that concept of consenting to learn in public, to not be afraid of that, to listen, and to give space to other people.
Thank you.
So my closing thoughts would be, to quote James Baldwin, who's on my shirt, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So that goes externally and internally. We have got to face these things before we can even address them.
Thanks, Adam.
I think my closing thoughts are, please access YWCA Lancaster as a resource, a community resource that is going to hit home. Also to continue on with that path of being courageous, holding space. I believe in doing both of those. Be courageous, hold space, and then heal, go out, activate for change. So those are my closing remarks.
Great. Thanks, each of you. I loved having this conversation. And, I'm looking forward to having some conversations like this about racial equity with some other community leaders going forward. So this is a great foundational piece for everyone, and so much knowledge and wisdom here. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for working with us at YWCA. And it's extra give. So thanks everyone for putting in that extra energy today as we work to gain additional support for the programs and opportunities at YWCA Lancaster. Thanks so much.